In this series, it looks like we're going to be moving away from the theme of the impending Civil War that's going to break out in 1860. But really, we're going to see, as we discuss the development of the new second party system that will be developing in the 1830s, the continuing influence of slavery, defenses of slavery, and how eventually this crisis over the expansion of slavery in these territories are going to eventually destroy the second party system, because these two political parties, the Whigs, who no longer exist today, they ceased to exist in the 1850s, and the Democrats, who can trace their origins back to this period, the development of the second party system. The modern Democratic Party is the same party that existed in the 1830s. That the crisis of slavery and civil war will eventually dissolve this second party system. Now, even before the second party system comes into existence, we can see some of the themes and problems that will be central to these two political parties by the 1830s. And one of the central controversies of the 1830s will be the Bank of the United States. After the War of 1812, the party of Jefferson had recreated the Bank of the United States as the first Bank of the United States. It had been put on a 20-year charter. So it began in 1816 and was set to expire in 1836. And like with the first bank, the intention of the Bank of the United States was that it was there to try and prevent speculative bubbles from developing. That was supposed to be its role, but in 1819, the Bank of the United States was not doing its job. The director of the bank, rather than making policies that would tend to dampen the wild speculative enthusiasm that was leading to a speculative bubble in 1819, actually contributed to it, rapidly increasing the value of land in what was then called the Southwest, Mississippi, Alabama. And when the bubble popped in 1819, the Bank of the United States found that it had overextended itself. Rather than preventing smaller banks from overextending themselves, the Bank of the U.S. had actually contributed to that. Now, the bank is going to survive. It's going to remain solvent. It's not going to close its doors forever. But it's able to do that in part by calling in loans, by basically foreclosing on people who had been failing to make payments, selling those lands at public auction, and recouping enough of its finances to be able to stay afloat. So the bank kept its doors open, but the consequence of that is that the bank is also going to create a lot of bad blood. You can imagine that lots of people who were either ruined personally by the bank's actions or new people who were ruined by the bank's actions are not going to have very fond memories of the Bank of the United States. And this will certainly come back to haunt the bank by the time we get to the 1830s. Now, in the 18-teens, after the War of 1812 and until the beginnings of the development of a new political system, new two-party system in the 1820s, we have an era of one-party rule. Sometimes this period is referred to as the era of good feelings. It's somewhat of a misnomer. It's called that because there's only one political party, but there were certainly enough political controversies in this period, even though there was only one political party. And in fact, the controversy that erupted over Missouri's attempted entrance into the United States as a slave state is an example of how actually having one political party allowed this controversy to explode. What happens is that Missouri in 1819 applied to become a state, a co-equal member. It submitted a constitution for approval by Congress, and this constitution included a slave code, which meant that Missouri would be entering the Union as a slave state. A northern representative who didn't want it to be a slave state introduced a rider to Missouri's application saying that yes, Missouri could be a slave state, but it would have to also agree to gradually abolish slavery. It was a gradual abolition amendment, not unlike what had been passed by Pennsylvania or New York. And you can imagine that the sectional controversy results in the kind of predictable outcome. Southern senators and representatives are outraged at the suggestion that slavery should be put on the slow road to extinction. Northern representatives are largely in favor of it. And even in 1820, we can start to see the outlines of how Southern and Northern representatives are going to relate to one another. The Northern population is already far outstripping the Southern population, so the House of Representatives, which has representatives based upon population of each state. The northern representatives are already far outnumbering southern representatives. But in the Senate, the South had essentially a veto power. Because there were equal numbers of southern and northern states, the Senate was able to block any attempt to put any sort of a rider on Missouri's entrance as a slave state. We might also wonder, why would northern representatives care? Who cares whether Missouri comes in as a slave state or not? Well, looking on the map in front of you, you can get some sense of why many northern representatives were concerned. Missouri is mostly north of what was evolving as the de facto border between slave and free states in the United States. That Ohio River had become the border between slave and free, and Missouri is mostly north of that border. Unlike Louisiana, which had a firmly entrenched slave system introduced by the French way back at the beginning of the 18th century, most of the slaves living in Missouri by the time it applied for statehood had been brought there by white masters migrating from Virginia or Kentucky further west. So Missouri looked like the slave states were invading the North. For many northern representatives, this appeared to be a place that should have been the inheritance of northern white workers who were free white workers. It should not have been the inheritance of slave owners in the South. It also showed that slavery was not a dying institution. This was a bit of a surprise to many Northerners because they rather assumed that slavery was on the slow road towards extinction. They believed that eventually Southern states would adopt gradual emancipation laws and slavery would eventually cease to exist. But Missouri showed that slavery was actually growing. It was not a shrinking institution, but a dynamic institution, an expanding institution. So Missouri caused a lot of concern for northern representatives, and eventually there is a compromise struck that has three parts to it. Missouri became a slave state, no strings attached. No gradual emancipation law, none of that, just a slave state. As a sort of compromise, the southern senators agreed to allow northern representatives to claim all land north of Missouri's southern border in the Louisiana Purchase as free territory. And all land south of that southern border of Missouri would be future territories for slave states. Now on the map in front of you, it looks like Northerners got the lion's share of the prize here. But looking at the voting of how Northern and Southern representatives voted, basically the South got its way. That apparently most representatives and senators believed that the proverbial state in the bag was better than two in the bush, and Missouri coming in as a slave state was the big prize. At the same time that Missouri becomes a slave state, Maine is introduced as a free state, and this maintains a sectional balance in the Senate that will be preserved or attempted to be preserved down to the Civil War. So in the midst of this one-party system, you can have this kind of sectional controversy because this one political party doesn't have to worry about losing one section or the other to the opposition and handing the national government over to the opposing party. We'll see that once we do enter a two-party system, both of those parties will rely upon northern and southern votes in order to gain control of the national government. And therefore, both political parties will be very concerned about saying anything regarding slavery. Because they fear if you say something about slavery, you might as well just hand the national government over to your opponents and call it a day. But because there is only one political party, representatives in that political party are free to voice their sectional anxieties without worrying about handing the national government over to the opposing side. Now in 1824, there's a national election. When the Constitution was first created, these appointed members of the Electoral College got to decide who would be president, but increasingly by the 1820s, most states were allowing for direct election of U.S. presidents. And therefore, you have popular votes to decide who's going to be president of the United States. It's a four-way race between the four candidates listed on the slide in front of you: John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson. As you can get a sense from this map showing you how various states voted in the election of 1824, you can see that they're kind of regional candidates. That Adams gets most of his support in the Northeast. Crawford gets most of his support in the Tidewater South, which is the extreme coastal region of the South. Although on the eve of the election he suffered a debilitating stroke and was therefore unable to hold office should he be elected. This likely sapped some support for him. But some people who were voting for him hoped that if Crawford were elected, another candidate would be appointed in his place. Henry Clay, who came in fourth, largely got his support from the West. He himself was from Kentucky. And Andrew Jackson, the person who got the most votes around the country, is the person who was probably the most national candidate as well. As you can see, he certainly got a lot of support in the South, but he also gets significant support in the mid-Atlantic states. He got more votes than anybody else, but that's not how presidential elections are won, as we know. The person who gets the majority of electoral college votes, gets a 50% plus one of the electoral college votes, that person becomes president of the United States. If nobody achieves that, if nobody gets a majority in the electoral college, then the vote goes to the House of Representatives to decide who's going to be president of the United States. So that's what happened in 1824. Nobody got a majority in the Electoral College, although Jackson clearly got more votes than anybody else. And surprisingly enough, the House of Representatives will decide to elect John Quincy Adams for president rather than rather than Andrew Jackson. John Quincy Adams, who was the runner-up in the popular vote, gets handed the election by the House. And shortly after being elected president, John Quincy Adams nominates Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. Now, in this day and age, being nominated to Secretary of State was a sort of sign that you were next in line for the presidency. James Madison had been Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. Thomas Jefferson had been Washington's Secretary of State. James Monroe had been James Madison's Secretary of State, and John Quincy Adams had been James Monroe's Secretary of State. So like today, how we tend to see the vice president's position as sort of a stepping stone to the presidency, in this day and age, people tended to view the Secretary of State's position as being the stepping stone to the presidency. So for some observers, looking at how this election went down, it appeared as though there had been some sort of a corrupt bargain struck between Clay and Adams. Clay, who had enormous followers in the House, many believed that he had used his influence to get Adams elected president and had made a deal with Adams to have himself nominated as Secretary of State so that he could be next in line for the presidency once Adams was set to retire. For many people looking at this situation, it appeared as though this was an insult to democratic rule, that if the white male majorities in states ought to be able to decide who the next president of the United States should be, then this appeared to be a slap in the face. So it was quite clear at the very beginning of John Quincy Adams' administration that the election of 1828 would be a rematch between Adams and the person who got the most popular votes, Andrew Jackson. And one person in particular who is going to work tirelessly to get Andrew Jackson elected is going to be the person on the slide in front of you here, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren was a politically savvy politician who had lots of experience working in the contentious politics of New York. And looking at a Jackson campaign, Van Buren notices that there are a lot of things going for Jackson. He notes that Jackson is already a household name. He's the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Everybody knows who Jackson is. He's widely beloved in the old Southwest, as it was called then, so the states of Mississippi and Alabama, in large part because he had opened up lots of territory to white plantation owners in the region by forcing the Creek Indians to sign away large swaths of land at the end of the War of 1812. So he's already a household name, he's already a beloved figure, he's got this kind of celebrity status that's going to already give him an edge in any sort of presidential election. Van Buren also recognizes that Jackson doesn't have to run on particular policy issues in 1828. We'll see that during his presidency, the policy issues that will divide Jackson's party, the Democrats, from the new opposition, the Whigs, will become clearer. But in 1828, Van Buren recognizes Jackson doesn't have to run on anything like the bank or internal improvements or anything like that. He only needs to run on this fuzzy issue of the corrupt bargain. You know, Jackson and his supporters can hammer home the message that the election of 1824 had been stolen from the people, meaning the white men who voted in these states, and they felt that presidential elections ought to be decided by the white male majorities who ought to be able to elect presidents. And so if you support democracy, if you support the people having a voice in politics, then you should vote for Jackson. If you support smoke-filled rooms deciding who's going to be president, then you vote for Adams. Well, who in the electorate is going to support Adams in such a framing of the situation? Obviously, most people are going to believe, who are voters, that the voters ought to be able to decide who's president. And so he can run on this no-losing issue in 1828 and does not have to focus on any sort of policy issues. So there are lots of great things about Jackson. He's got national name. He can run on this fuzzy issue of the corrupt bargain. He also has this lovely rags to riches story, which makes him have wide popular appeal. Jackson had been born to an impoverished family in North Carolina, rose to wealth supposedly through his own hard work and pluck. As you'll notice in your reading from after the fact, that some people take issue with that suggestion, that perhaps Jackson had more insider connections that allowed him to become wealthy than he is traditionally regarded. But that's not the slogan of the Van Buren campaign for Jackson. The slogan is he's got this rags to riches story. His impoverished background means that even though he's one of the wealthiest people in the country by the time he's running for president in 1828, he's able to lay claim to this belief that as someone who born into poverty, he understands the plight of the average white male working man. And in that kind of rags to riches argument, you can see the contours of American elections even to this day. That's why whenever somebody runs for president in modern political campaigns, nobody says, I was born into wealth and you should vote for me because I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth. Everyone wants to adopt some sort of rags to riches story because it allows you to make this argument that you understand the average voter because you've lived through those experiences too. No one wants to vote for somebody who won't understand the problems facing the average voter around the country. And Van Buren was also just a masterful disciplinarian when it came to party politics. He knew how to organize a campaign. He knew how to organize enthusiasm. There were lots of barbecues and essentially parties held in honor of Jackson. At these events, they sang songs extolling Jackson's virtues at the Battle of New Orleans, so that you can ramp up enthusiasm for Jackson in the years leading up to the election of 1828. And it works stupendously. Jackson wins by a landslide in 1828. Adams loses immensely, and the campaign for Jackson works. And it's going to be Jackson's time in office where we see the contours of the political opposition becoming the Whig Party. One of the branches of the Whig Party will be formed by Jackson's actions during what becomes known as the Nullification Crisis. Van Buren, in the months leading up to the election of 1828, had been working in Congress to try and drum up support for Jackson, and part of the deal was that he was going to be passing these protective tariffs on various products made in the Northwest, meaning Ohio, Indiana, as well as the Northeast. Once these laws are passed, many people in what was then the Cotton South were outraged. The Cotton South was producing most of the world's cotton at this point for this expanding market of textile mills, and they believed that these taxes on foreign imports were essentially taxes on cotton producers. They were the ones paying all the money for these manufactured items, and this was going to increase the cost for the products that they had to buy. If Northerners couldn't find something profitable to do, then they needed to do something else. But the government shouldn't be supporting them in their mediocre business enterprises, was the feeling of many in the Cotton South. South Carolina responded by nullifying the new tariffs. The legislature in South Carolina declared that these taxes would not be collected at the port of Charleston. When Jackson becomes president, he declares that, oh, yes, they are. He had something of a law and order streak in him during the campaign of 1812 through 1815. He was known to execute deserting soldiers. He was not above using extreme force to enact this discipline that he felt was necessary. So he pushed through Congress something known as the Force Bill. And the force bill said, well, South Carolina, you can collect these tariffs, or the U.S. military will come into the state and collect them for you and force you to collect these tariffs. At about the same time the force bill was passed, the Congress passes a compromise tariff, which lowered the taxes on these goods. And the South Carolina legislature promptly responded by nullifying the force bill, but accepting the compromise tariffs, which means that this was all a done deal anyway. You didn't need the force bill if they accepted the tariffs. But it did leave a bad taste in the mouth of many Tidewater Southerners for Jackson. Many of these people felt that Jackson had pushed things too hard, had betrayed the region, and therefore became part of a political opposition working against Jackson. And then as well, a number of moral reformers will come to regard Jackson's administration with some suspicion. The Jackson administration tends to take what we might call a laissez-faire approach to government intervention. The Jackson administration will tend to shrink government involvement rather than expand it. But many moral reformers, people interested in using either state or national government to create either asylums or K through 12 education, or what would be today called K through 12 education, universities, things like that, didn't see Jackson as their champion because he tended to shrink government involvement rather than expand it. And certainly Jackson's actions during the Indian removal crisis leads a lot of moral reformers to the conclusion that Jackson is not their friend, especially as it came down to the Cherokees. The Cherokees fought very hard in the courts to try and prevent themselves from being forcibly removed from northern Georgia and southern Tennessee and North Carolina to sites designated for them in what's now Oklahoma. They felt that they were guaranteed this land by treaty with the United States. They eventually sued all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court essentially agreed with them. Well, agreed with them in most parts. The Cherokee wanted to regard themselves as an independent country. The Supreme Court eventually declared that's not quite the case, but that they were domestically dependent nations, so that they should not be subject to the laws of the states in which they existed, but they were underneath the authority of the national government. And the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee could not be removed. It's not quite clear if Jackson actually said this. This might be an apocryphal story, but supposedly Jackson is rumored to have said, the Supreme Court has made its decision, now let it enforce it, meaning that the Supreme Court doesn't have an army, Jackson does, and so Jackson encourages removal of the Cherokees anyway, despite the ruling of the Supreme Court. Jackson's support for Indian removal likely got him back a lot of the support he had lost in the Cotton South. As you can see on the map in front of you, many of the Indian people who had been forcibly removed from the Southwest, or what was then called the Old Southwest, opened up a lot of prime cotton-growing land to white plantation owners or prospective white plantation owners who saw money signs in the land left by these Indian people. But it certainly ruined any sort of alliance that Jackson may have had with moral reformers. Moral reformers in particular were shocked because at the center of these Supreme Court cases were a few missionaries working amongst the Cherokee who had been opening schools there. Moral reformers saw this as undermining those efforts, and many of them abandoned Jackson because of this. But again, there were clear senses that moral reformers would not see much going for Jackson anyway. And then in 1832, the election of 1832 will hinge on whether or not this Bank of the United States ought to exist. Henry Clay, who always wanted to be president but never became president, was hoping to run for president in 1832, but felt like he needed something to run against Jackson on. Jackson at this point had made some suggestions that he was opposed to several parts of Clay's American system. He had suggested, but not officially stated, that he was not a fan of the Bank of the United States. And so Clay wanted to make it an issue. He wanted Jackson to go on the record saying one way or another whether he liked the bank, and Clay thought for sure that Jackson would say that he didn't. So even though the bank's charter was not set to expire until 1836, Clay went to the director of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, and asked him to go to Congress requesting a rechartering of the bank in 1832. Biddle did just that, went to Congress. Congress dutifully passed a rechartering of the bank in 1832, went to Jackson's desk, and Jackson vetoed it, much to the delight of Clay. Clay expected Jackson to do that. In fact, he was hoping Jackson was going to do that so that Clay could turn the bank into the key issue for the presidential election of 1832. Now, Clay thought that Jackson's vetoing of the bank would show him as sort of a financially ignorant person who didn't understand how national finances worked, that his policies would ruin the national economy. Jackson, however, turned the bank issue into support for him. He framed the bank as an institution supporting wealthiest Americans, an institution that was at odds with the interest of most hardworking white men around the country. That what you had were a few political insiders who used their financial connections to get legislation passed like the Bank of the United States that benefited wealthy people and hurt poor people. So Jackson's veto message was framed in such a way that it advanced this message of I am a supporter of democracy and my opponent is a supporter of secret insiders. And as you can see on the slide in front of you, the election of 1832 was a runaway success for Jackson. He won by a landslide, and he interpreted this landslide election for Jackson as a real indictment of the bank. The bank had been the big issue in the election of 1832, and so Jackson probably rightly assumed that this was a referendum on the bank, and most voting Americans had clearly shown their dislike for the bank. So after being reelected, Jackson went about the process of trying to destroy what he came to call the monster bank. He directed his Secretary of the Treasury to take federal deposits out of the bank. According to law, federal tax money collected was supposed to be deposited in the Bank of the United States. His Secretary of the Treasury said no, so Jackson fired him. Hired another guy. This new Secretary of the Treasury also said no, so Jackson fired that guy too. Finally, he found this guy, Roger Taney, who became Secretary of the Treasury under Jackson, and Taney did exactly what Jackson told him to do. He took the money out of the Bank of the United States, deposited it in various state banks that Jackson's opponents later called his pet banks, his favorite banks, and basically destroyed the Bank of the United States without having to pass any laws. He just simply changed where the money was going and deprived the Bank of the United States of the money it needed to survive. It's at this point that many people around the country were sympathetic to the image as you see it in front of you here. The political opposition that was starting to coalesce around Jackson after 1832 came to regard Jackson as a tyrant, somebody who was abusing his veto powers. You can see on his left hand here he's got this veto message. His opponents claimed the veto should only be used when the president had constitutional qualms against legislation, and they felt that Jackson was using the veto whenever he just didn't like something. And they felt that was not the way the veto should be used. And because he was using it in that way, they felt he was creating far too much power underneath himself. So you see him depicted here as King Andrew I with a scepter and a crown and a regal coat there. And underneath his feet, you can see him trampling on the U.S. Constitution. He's torn it up and trampled it underfoot. So because of this image of Jackson as King Andrew I, the political opposition will call themselves the Whigs. Now, the name Whig sounds like the stuffiest, most boring name you could give a political party today, but for people in the 1830s, this is a powerful political reference because the name Whig is a reference to the American Revolution. The patriots in the Revolution at the time were sometimes called Whigs. The loyalists, the pro-British people, were sometimes called Tories. And so what the Whig Party was trying to claim is that they were trying to claim the inheritance of the patriots back in the Revolution. Just like those patriots in 1776 were fighting against King George III, these new Whigs claimed they were now fighting against the centralizing powers that Andrew Jackson was claiming under himself, this new King Andrew I. Like all political parties, the Whigs are somewhat of a big tent. They include supporters of Henry Clay's American system. Henry Clay was calling for the national government to institute protective tariffs, to try and create a diverse economy in the United States, some with industrialization, various products being produced. The reality is that most of the exports out of the United States prior to the Civil War were in form of cotton, and Clay and others like him wanted to diversify the American economy much more. And they saw the protective tariff, taxes on foreign imports that were so high that it encouraged Americans to buy domestically produced items as a way to accomplish that. They called on the national government to support internal improvements, meaning roads, canals, and eventually by the 1840s railroads. And they called for American support, national support for the Bank of the United States. The Whigs also draw upon a lot of support from moral reformers, so various people interested in asylum reform, education reform, temperance reform. All of these people will tend to fall into the Whig Party. And also a number of Southerners, particularly in the Tidewater South, the extreme coastal regions of Virginia, south through Georgia, who were opposed to Jackson, at least in part because of the nullification crisis. So quite a big tent. All of these people can agree that they don't like Jackson for various reasons. But we'll see once the Whigs gain control of the national government, it becomes a bit harder to mobilize this diverse political coalition to actually get things done. Now, since both of these political parties depend upon support in both the North and the South, neither one of these political parties wants to have anything to do with the institution of slavery or say anything about slavery in national politics, is what I should have said. That if the Whigs say something about slavery that is seen as anti-slavery in the South, they might as well kiss the Southern wing of the party goodbye and just hand the election over to the Democrats. And if the Democrats say something in support of slavery, they might as well kiss the Northern wing of the party goodbye and just hand the country over to the Whigs. So neither party has any interest in talking about the issue of slavery at all, and this new political party system is developing at just about the same time that Northern abolitionism is becoming a more active institution, a more active reform movement. William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator is first published in 1831, and one of the efforts of abolitionists will be to mail copies of The Liberator and other abolitionist literature to the South in an event known as the Mailing Campaign of 1835. The feeling was that, sure, that if you're subscribing to The Liberator, you're probably an abolitionist, you already believe this stuff. That's not the people they want to reach. They want to reach pro-slavery Southerners who are deluded and don't understand the evils of their own behavior. The reaction in the white South is outrage. On the picture in front of you is an artist depiction of white Southerners breaking into a post office and burning all the abolitionist literature they found inside. The feeling of many in the white South is that what the abolitionists were trying to accomplish was a slave insurrection, akin to what had happened in 1831 with Nat Turner's revolt. So the white South is outraged. And in addition to the mailing campaign, abolitionists also did things like sign petitions. The feeling was in abolitionism that, well, the national government claims they can't do anything about slavery because it's a state institution. But Washington, D.C. is different. Washington, D.C. is a city administered by the national government. And so abolitionists argued, well, at least the national government ought to be able to do something about the slave trade in D.C. Let's pass around a petition to at least encourage Congress to end the slave trade in Washington, D.C. The feeling of abolitionists is, how scandalous is it that when foreign ambassadors come to the United States and are stationed in Washington, D.C., they might be going for a walk down the street and see a slave auction? Is this really the image of the United States we want to send overseas? So these petitions come into Congress. Congress doesn't want to have anything to do with them, and so eventually they adopt the gag rule. The gag rule essentially says anytime an anti-slavery abolitionist petition comes to Congress, that they're just going to table it and not talk about it. One person who thought this was ridiculous was John Quincy Adams. After losing the election of 1828, he goes back home to Massachusetts and eventually runs as a representative. He wins and basically stays in his representative seat until he dies. He actually dies in his seat in the House. And increasingly, as a representative, he falls into the abolitionist camp, and he thinks it's just ridiculous that Congress feels as though it can ignore a petition of their representatives, of their constituents, rather. Is it really okay for them not to pay attention to what their constituents want? So this is a portion of a political cartoon published from the period. On the slide in front of you is a picture of an artist's depiction of Adams here. Behind him is a bale of cotton and the slaves who grew and packed it. And what he's trying to do in this depiction here is sneak it onto the floor. What Adams tended to do is be rather passive-aggressive about this. If they were debating something completely unrelated to slavery, he'd often stand up and say, now, wait a minute here. Does this have anything to do with slavery? Because if it does, we shouldn't talk about it and we should table this. So certainly it was controversial, and it also shows how once we move into this two-party system, both of these political parties will tend to do their best to stifle the growing uproar over the institution of slavery, because neither of these political parties saw any advantage in talking about the slavery issue. And in 1837, Jackson has retired. So he's elected in 1828, follows the principle established by Washington, and only serves 2 terms in office, does not seek re-election in 1836. Instead, hands things over to his then vice president, Martin Van Buren. He encourages his supporters to vote for Van Buren. Van Buren wins. And then shortly after taking office, a deep financial depression hits the United States. This depression occurs for predictable reasons. As most depressions in American history occur, it occurs because of speculative bubbles. And they occur about a fairly regular cycle in American history. You know, you go back to 1819, you've got 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1892. You know, they just kind of pop up on a fairly regular cycle. And they often occur because the value of something is supposedly never going to go down. It will always go up, and so you better get into it any way you can. Take out risky loans, whatever you need to do to buy this thing. And then lo and behold, that thing apparently doesn't have as much value as everyone expected, and people start to lose their shirts. That if you have invested in this and you've taken out these risky loans, when you find out the value is not there, you're going to lose everything. And so the Whigs have the advantage of being able to blame the Democrats. The Whigs, who were not in control of the government, claimed that it was the bad financial decisions of the Democrats who caused this mess. They smartly argued that the Bank of the United States was supposed to be there to prevent such a bubble from happening. The Democrats destroyed it, and so this was obviously all their fault. Van Buren's got the more difficult task of trying to explain how this wasn't the Democrats' fault. He generally tends to put his foot in his mouth. He tends to suggest that people who were suffering made their own beds here, that they made some risky investments and now they're reaping their own consequences. That's never a good argument to make. You always want to find somebody else to blame besides the voters. And so one thing the Whigs will have going for them in the election of 1840 is this panic of 1837. And in the election of 1840, the Whigs will essentially steal the winning strategy of the Democrats and use it for themselves. In 1840, the Whigs nominate a war hero, a person who was known because of his victory over Tecumseh at the Battle of Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison. There's a picture of Harrison in front of his proverbial log cabin. In that campaign, a Democratic newspaper, there was no impartial press at this time. Newspapers were explicitly funded by one political party or the other. So a Democratic newspaper was trying to suggest that Harrison was an alcoholic, and they said if you vote for Harrison, all he's going to do is take a barrel of hard cider, go back to his log cabin in the woods, and drink his days away. Now, the Whigs get this message and they run with it. And they say, that's exactly who Harrison is. He's a hard-drinking American, just like other hard-drinking Americans. He's the kind of guy you want to have a beer with, to use a modern political understanding of things. He's a guy who works with his hands. He does, in fact, live in a log cabin in the woods, because they realize in order to win a national election, you've got to make your candidate somebody who can identify with average Joes out there, somebody who's like the average white male voter out there, who can say he understands me because he knows where I come from, because he comes from there too. So they're trying to adopt that kind of rags to riches story for Harrison. The Democrats, in making this statement about the log cabin, sort of hand the issue over to Harrison and allow the Whigs to run with it. Unlike with Jackson, this is total hogwash when it comes to Harrison, though. Harrison had been born to a family of land speculators. He had been born into considerable money by the time that he was running for president. He still had lots of money. But Whigs know that doesn't win a campaign. You don't win a campaign by saying I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth. You win a campaign by saying I understand where you're coming from because I came from there too. I too had to rise from rags to riches through my own pluck and hard work so that I can achieve the position I have today. On that ticket with Harrison, the Whigs nominate John Tyler. John Tyler was from Virginia. The Whigs do this to try and emphasize that they're not a sectional ticket, that they're a national ticket. Harrison is from Ohio, Tyler is from Virginia, So you have a Northerner and a Southerner on the ticket, so the Whigs can lay claim to being a national party, not a sectional Northern party. If they win, and Harrison is elected president. Now, Harrison's elected president. Inaugurations in this day and age occurred in March. It was apparently a fairly cold and rainy March. Harrison supposedly gave one of the longest inaugural addresses in U.S. history on this cold and rainy day. Got a cold. This cold developed into pneumonia, and a month after taking office, Harrison died. It was the first time this happened in American history. We'd never had a sitting president die while in office before. And so to the shock and horror of the Whigs, the sort of afterthought on the ticket, the slogan of the campaign had been Tippecanoe and Tyler too, sort of suggesting that Tyler was sort of an afterthought. All of a sudden, this afterthought becomes president. And the standard bearer of the party in the presidential office, the Whigs take over Congress as well. They pass predictable legislation, a new system of protective tariffs, a new bank bill. They forward it on to Tyler's desk, and he vetoes it. Clay and his allies don't freak out. They decide, let's go meet with the guy, let's go talk with him, see what he wants. They think they understand his perspective. They think they pass a new bank bill that's going to meet his demands, and then he vetoes that too. And it's at this point that the Whigs start to refer to Tyler as his accidency, meaning he wasn't supposed to be there. He's messing up the agenda of the Whigs and not allowing it to become law, and they're intent on writing him out of the party. But Tyler is in no mood to become an afterthought. He's in no mood to end his political career. And so he wants to try and find some issue that he can use to craft maybe a new political party underneath himself. If he can't get the Whig nomination for president, maybe he can find some new agenda around which he can craft his own political party. And he thinks he finds it in this idea of manifest destiny. There was a movement in the 1840s suggesting that it was the obvious destiny of the United States to expand and cross the country, expand to the Pacific. The painting in front of you here on this slide sort of graphically portrays the sentiments of those believers in manifest destiny. In the East, you have the railroads and telegraph lines and farming settlers moving west to turn that land into productive capital that can be sold. The trains will take the farm produce back east, sell it, and in the minds of these manifest destiny folks, the people who inhabit these lands are living in darkness. If you look closely on the painting, you can see in the shadows are Native Americans who are being pushed out by these white settlers as they turn this land into productive farmland. As far as manifest destiny people were concerned, the Mexican government, which controlled much of the West, was sort of wasting it. They didn't see the Mexican government using it to its utmost potential, meaning using it to transform that land into capital, and they wanted to move it out west in order to accomplish that. Now, neither political party wanted to say much about manifest destiny because it appeared as though you couldn't really talk about westward expansion without talking about the issue of slavery. And we've already established that neither the Whigs nor the Democrats wanted to talk about slavery. Now, the reason this is the case is because of Texas. Texas, by the 1840s, was the obvious place to begin this program of Western expansion. Texas had declared its independence from Mexico in 1836. Essentially, Mexico had tried to invite some white Americans to move to the region to try and populate the place. These people eventually revolted against Texas. Part of the reason they revolted against Texas is because, or revolted against Mexico, I'm sorry, is because of their desire to expand slavery there. Slavery was technically illegal in Mexico. These settlers, however, moved to Texas to expand cotton production there. When we think of Texas, we think of cowboys, we think of cows. But in eastern Texas, it's moist, it's humid, it's hot. It's a prime cotton-growing region. So these people are moving there to grow cotton. So they revolted. They are successful in their revolt. They achieve independence, and as soon as they achieve independence, they try to be annexed to the United States. And it's here where the controversy begins, because you can't talk about annexing Texas without talking about expanding the institution of slavery. And certainly some Southern politicians put their feet in their mouths, including John C. Calhoun, who is a senator from South Carolina. He claimed that in a letter to a friend that the United States needed to annex Texas right away because he was convinced the British were working in Texas to try and abolish the institution there. By the 1830s, the British Empire had abolished slavery, so Calhoun believed that the British were trying to abolish slavery in Texas, and in his letter, he said that America needed to annex Texas right away before slavery was destroyed there. Now, when the letter hits the press, the abolitionists go bananas. They say, this is exactly what we've told you. Here, what do we have but a Southern politician saying explicitly that the U.S. needs to adopt policies intentionally designed to save the institution of slavery. That the reason the U.S. wants to annex Texas to the United States is in order to save slavery there. So you can't talk about Texas without talking about slavery, and because of that, neither the waning days of the Jackson administration nor the Van Buren administration wanted to talk about Texas. But for John Tyler, he saw Texas as the way to preserve his political career. That he could talk about expansion because neither of the other political parties wanted to talk about it, and this would become his issue. And in early 1844, it appeared as though Tyler's plan was working. Most people believed that Van Buren was going to be the nominee of the Democrats, and that Henry Clay would be the nominee for the Whigs. And predictably enough, neither one of them wanted to talk about the issue of expansion because they didn't want to talk about Texas. But to the surprise of most folks, the Democratic Party did not nominate Van Buren for president. Instead, the Democrats nominated a dark horse candidate, James K. Polk, for president, and Polk stole Tyler's thunder. He was running on an explicitly expansionist platform, but he tries to craft an expansionist platform that would be a national platform, not a sectional platform. So yes, he said the U.S. needs to annex Texas, but he also supported the claims of pro-Oregon folks. At the time Polk was running for president, Oregon, as you can see it understood on the slide in front of you, Oregon in this day and age was not the state that we have today, but this territory that ran from northern California up to the border of Alaska. It was jointly occupied according to a treaty between the United States and Britain in Canada. And a movement of people who had migrated from the United States to Oregon was saying that the U.S. needed to annex all of this. By rights, they believed this ought to belong to the United States, not to the British in Canada. And so they were their punchline, their slogan was 54-40 or fight, meaning that the U.S. needed to claim all of Oregon up to the 54-40 line with Russian Alaska, or be willing to go to war with Britain to get it. So Polk, on the one hand, supported annexation of Texas. On the other hand, he supported Oregon, and that seems to be a sectionally balanced expansionism. The North gets Oregon, the South gets Texas, and everybody should be happy. We'll see, however, that James K. Polk's decision to support expansionism is going to lead the nation eventually towards disunion. That the expansion that Polk successfully accomplishes during his time in office is going to lead to the controversies that will eventually divide the nation by 1860.